Anyone out there who has delved into the dark world that is true crime has those handful of cases that just seem to stand out among the rest. Whether it be the gruesome details surrounding a crime itself or a cold case that ironically has a mountain of evidence behind it. These are just a few of those cases. So sit back and relax as we step out into the abyss. Monday, November 28, 2016. Police are conducting a welfare check at a home located in Knoxville, Tennessee. And after knocking quite a few times, not a single person comes to the door. It was at this point they began walking the perimeter of that house, taking note of a couple of things. For starters, there is this overbearing smell of chemicals that almost seemed like something was burning inside of that home. However, there are no flames or any indication that a fire had actually taken place. Even more concerning, when peeking through a window near the front door, several bags of groceries can be seen, some of which blatantly contain perishable items. And well, all of these combined factors give them enough probable cause to force entry into the home, but absolutely nothing could have prepared them for what they were about to walk into. Within just a few seconds of gaining entry, they notice a set of hands just straight up laying in the hallway, completely detached from whoever they belong to. And so, on heightened alert, they draw their weapons and begin clearing rooms one by one. A terrifying scene would unfold. One of the homeowners, Mr. Joel Guy Sr., was discovered completely torn apart in an upstairs exercise room, absolutely covered in defensive markings. In addition to this, everywhere around him, there were obvious and blatant signs that an extremely violent struggle had taken place. And that's not even really what makes this case so disturbing, because you see in other areas of that home, multiple vats were found containing hideous amounts of chemicals in accordance with what was left of Joel's wife, Lisa Guy. Here's what went down. In the weeks leading up to this discovery, the couple had informed their then 28-year-old son they would no longer be financially supporting him. It was at that point he wrote down a 14-point plan or manifesto to end his parents' lives, a list of which is now referred to as the Book of Premeditation. And on November 26th of 2016, while his mother was out buying groceries, Joel Michael Guy Jr. ambushed his father in that upstairs workout room. And just after his mother returned home, as she was walking up the stairs to check on Joel Sr., she too was savagely attacked by Jr. When everything was said and done, he started the process of dismantling his very own parents. Then he set the thermostat to 90 degrees Fahrenheit and drove right on back to LSU. It was during that time period he received medical attention for a laceration on his thumb. Another poor decision on his part is that would ultimately come back and be used as evidence against him. Regardless, that following Monday, Lisa, his mother, failed to show up to work. And she was never the type of person to at least not give them a call to let them know what was going on. And this is why they were performing that welfare check. Well, not only did they find the aforementioned horrors inside of that home, this is also where they found Junior's Book of Premeditation. So in addition to this absolute mountain of evidence they already had against him, further investigation would find him on camera purchasing the vats, the chemicals, and lastly, the weapons used during the crime itself. Just a short while later, he was arrested while trying to flee his apartment in Baton Rouge. He has since been sentenced to life without the possibility of parole, just barely escaping the death penalty. Lastly, in case you were wondering just what the hell happened to this guy's face, Dude Man actually had an abscessed tooth and had yet to receive any treatment for it prior to this photo being taken. This next one takes us to the town of Villisca back in 1912. You see, there was this rather affluent Presbyterian family known as the Moores. Well, this family of 6 consisted of parents Josiah and Sarah along with their 4 children, Herman, Mary, Arthur, and Paul. Now it is said the Moores were sort of an upstanding family within the community. This isn't to say no one had a grudge against them, but for the most part, not a lot of people had a beef with them. As a matter of fact, many of the citizens in that surrounding area found themselves purchasing supplies from Josiah's agricultural supply store. Well, it was mainly due to this store's success he became one of the leading businessmen around town. In addition to this, Josiah would also diversify his investments, purchasing a few more already fully functioning businesses as well. Now, as time went on, it just seemed like the sky was the limit for the Moore family. That is, until the night of June 9th, 1912. The entire family, along with 2 house guests, who were also children, had just got done attending an evening service at Villisca Presbyterian Church. It was at this time they made their way back home, where it is presumed the children indulged in a few cookies shortly before going to bed. Now, Sarah and Josiah would stay up just a little while longer before going to bed themselves. So at this point, you have 6 children, 2 adults, a total of 8 individuals all sleeping inside that home. Or so they thought. It is said that while they were attending church, an individual had broken into their home and made their way up into the attic. It was there they would smoke a few cigarettes, waiting it out for the perfect opportunity to strike. And at some point between the hours of midnight and 5 a.m., the killer or killers exited the attic of that home and made their way to the master bedroom. It was at that time several blows were delivered to Mr. and Mrs. Moore, killing them in the process. The intruder then began making his way through the rest of the house, entering the boys' bedroom next and taking them all out one by one. And one thing that's a little odd is throughout this entire attack, Mr. and Mrs. Moore were the only ones who suffered the fate with the sharp end of that axe. For one reason or another, the killer had switched to the blunt end of it on all of the children. At any rate, as this terrifying atrocity is taking place, it is said one of the 2 visiting children, Lena Stillinger, had woken up. Now, whether this was when her sister was being murdered right next to her in that guest bedroom, or whether she woke up at some other point, is unknown. But the reason this is believed to be true is because Lena was the only one in the house with any sort of defensive wounds. This, coupled with the fact she had been found sprawled out on top of the sheets of that bed, are quite synonymous with somebody being knocked out from a standing position onto the bed itself. Well, after the killer or killers were absolutely sure everyone in the house had been killed, he, she, or they made their way back to the master bedroom to deliver a few more blows to Josiah and Sarah. And it is widely believed that whoever these killers were had a personal vendetta against the Moore parents. Not only because of the amount of wounds that were found on them, but whoever these killers were became so enraged during this attack, they had been lifting the axe so high on the upswings, they actually took out a couple of chunks from the ceiling as well. Now, it's presumed that at this point the killers made their way back into the kitchen of the home, pulling out a slab of bacon and leaving it next to the very murder weapon used inside that house. Well, roughly 2 hours later at around 7 a.m., the Moore's neighbor Mary Peckham began to notice there was absolutely no movement whatsoever in or around the Moore's house. Now, this was highly unusual, as every morning, for as long as she can remember, the Moores had a very specific routine, and the kids all had chores, but nothing was being done. And so Mary goes and knocks on the door, but there's no response. She then places a call to Ross Moore, Josiah's brother, to inform him of this inactivity, and he too immediately became concerned. Upon arriving, he would try to knock several times, but to no avail. Complete silence. Ross then takes out a spare key that had been given to him by Josiah, turns the lock, walks inside, but nothing, and I mean nothing, could have prepared him for the grisly scene that awaited him inside that domicile. Mary stays on the porch while Ross makes his way through the home, and the first victims to be discovered were the Stillinger sisters inside that guest bedroom. Ross then screams for Mary to call the Villisca primary peace officer, a man by the name of Henry Horton. It wasn't until this officer's walkthrough that the other victims would be discovered, all 8 of whom had long since passed away due to their injuries. Well, news of this crime would spread like wildfire all across the region and eventually the rest of the United States, instilling a newfound fear in the hearts of many. As around this time period, there had been a rash of similar random acts of violence all over that region. And while there were strikingly similar cases from Iowa and the surrounding area, none of them were ever proven to be linked. Now, I also think it's worth pointing out, law enforcement practices back then were quite sloppy at best, and during the course of the investigation, several suspects were brought inside that home in order to attempt to recreate the crime if they were the ones to have done it, essentially handing them the murder weapon and telling them to describe them how they would have done it if they had. Thus, everything inside that house was absolutely contaminated. And it's also worth pointing out that at that time there were in fact a few suspects, one of which being a previous employer of Josiah, Frank Jones. Now, the main reason he was considered to be a prime suspect in this case is that Josiah had quite literally taken business from Frank upon resigning his position at Frank's agricultural supply store. It is also said he took over the equipment rental market in the area by opening his own John Deere store, and many people assumed there had to have been some sort of grudge between the two. However, more than a fair share of individuals placed their bet on a traveling minister by the name of George Kelly. I mean, not only did this guy have a very peculiar background, but People in various towns had reported him for being a peeping Tom. In addition to this, on several of those occasions, it was also reported he had solicited underage girls to, let's just say, pose for him in provocative ways. Well, George had came into town on June 8th to give that very sermon the Moores had attended on that fateful night. And when everything was said and done, he ended up skipping town somewhere between 5:30 and 5:50 a.m. on the very morning the murders took place. Although he would be tried twice for this crime, the first of those two trials ended in a hung jury, meaning although some of the jury did in fact think he was guilty, the votes were not unanimous. As for the second trial, Mr. Kelly was acquitted on all charges. With that in mind, a few more suspects were investigated. However, all were completely exonerated from the particular crime, meaning the Villisca Axe Murders still remain unsolved to this day. Now, the last thing I wanted to add in reference to this story is that there is a slight discrepancy with the fact cigarettes were found in the attic. While some sources state they in fact were found, others state that this simply wasn't true. In addition to this, some sources even go on to state that Mr. Moore himself used to go into the attic on certain occasions to smoke a cigarette. So whether or not the killer came in while they were at church or while they were asleep is still up for debate. This particular story takes us back to 1914, just 2 years after the infamous Villisca Axe Murders. There was a place just near Asheboro, North Carolina, referred to as the Pisgah section. And while yes, the Pisgah section itself took up a sizable portion of the state, for our reference, we're closer to Asheboro in a place called Randolph County. Just off of an extremely secluded road lied a house that belonged to a man named Lo Daniels. This was in an area that was essentially cut off from the rest of North Carolina. One road in, one road out. Thick and luscious overgrown forests on both sides. In addition to this, many of the families that lived along this road, including the Daniels, were well known to law enforcement as moonshiners. These people did not take any crap from the police. Situations along this road were handled for the most part amongst themselves. More so, even if they wanted the law to intervene, their minimum response time was about 5 hours. It was about 2 hours for the victim or someone who knew what had happened to get into town just to be able to notify the police of an incident. Then, once everything was said and done, another 2.5 hours for them to get back out there. And that's if they were ready to go at that point in time. Regardless, it is said, Lo Daniels had been attempting to distance himself from the life he had been living. He married a woman, got himself a house in the middle of nowhere, popped out a few kids, became self-sustaining. In essence, the guy wanted to be left alone with his family. However, this was a dream that had become increasingly more difficult as he constantly had a few unwanted guests within his home. That being his sister, her husband, and his sister-in-law. They would take it upon themselves to just come on over and stay for days on end. And what made him so mad about this was that they would absolutely help themselves to his food, his water, his supplies, never one time offering to help out with any of the chores or even make an attempt to pay him back. So one day, Lo Daniels wakes up and he just explodes at everybody. He tells them, look, I'm going to be leaving for a few days. I'm heading east to pick up a few things and try and clear my own head. And by the time I get back, y'all had better be gone. I am not kidding. I am not playing around. If you know what is good for you and yours, you will be gone by the time I get back. That being said, he hopped on his mule and headed off. Little did they know just how serious he actually was. Over that brief period of time, they continued to eat, they continued to drink, they didn't clean up, and when he got back, the place was an absolute disaster. Expecting some sort of verbal scolding, they step out onto the porch, ultimately believing Lo is just going to do what he always does. Yell at him for a bit, walk it off, head inside, and everything will just go back to normal. But it didn't. Lo said not a single word to anyone there. He tied up his mule, fed it, watered it, went back inside and cleaned himself off. It was at this point he completely checked out while sitting on the porch, distancing himself from any and all conversation. And while things did seem a little off to his wife, ultimately she continued on with her day as well. That is, until the clock struck 7. Lo finally got up out of his chair. He calmly walked inside, went back into his room, grabbed a shotgun, and just started mowing people down within that home. First to go would be Edgar, his brother-in-law, who had been sitting just outside of Lo's bedroom as he entered the living area. He took one to the face at point-blank range, losing his life in an instant. His wife, who was standing just a few feet away, screamed out while holding their infant daughter. He made eye contact with her. She turned away to try and shield the child, attempting to make a run for it, but he fired once more, striking her in the back and in the back of the arm. She goes down. At this point, his sister-in-law entered the room from the porch to figure out just what in the hell had been going on. She, too, was struck down by Lowe with a single blast. Simultaneously, Lowe's sister, his own kin, entered the living room from the kitchen, and with one final shot, she would unfortunately lose her life as well. So now, in the middle of absolutely nowhere in North Carolina, no one around for miles, this ultimately horrible crime has taken place. There is no one around that would have heard the gunshots, let alone their screams. And through all of this madness, this tragedy, his wife had somehow managed to drag herself out onto the porch, still holding their infant child. And as she lay there, crying out for help, pleading him to not do anything else, like a scene straight out of the movie Deliverance, Lowe places the firearm down, grabs his banjo, sits down on his rocking chair, and begins to strum away. At around 9 p.m., Lowe's father-in-law, who was supposed to be visiting, approached the property by foot, alarmed by the sounds of children crying and the sound of the banjo in the distance. There was this cold silence outside of those two sounds, and something just didn't feel right. Once he got close enough, he noticed what was described as a river of red flowing off of the steps of the front porch. His daughter began calling out for help. Lowe, still sitting there, staring off into the distance, playing that banjo. He ran off in order to notify the police, but as stated prior, it would take them a total of 5 hours to actually make it to the Daniels residence. And as the story goes, he was sitting there in that same spot, playing the banjo, amongst his wife, the carnage, and his crying children. Now miraculously, his wife would end up recovering quite well, all things considered. She did lose a lot of the mobility in that arm. But the reason we know this story is because this is the same story she told the courtroom during his trial. In addition to this, his eldest child would even go on to testify that his father was the actual devil himself, as no good person could ever do something so evil. Even though Lowe received life in prison for his actions on that fateful night, he'd break out of prison at least 2 times that were actually documented. And on the latter of those 2 times, he had been writing his wife. She did everything she could to try and make her location unknown. And when he was finally caught walking down a set of railroads in Asheboro, he told officers he was going to pay his wife a visit.